Hi again. In Samuel Andrews' book, Christianity and Anti-Christianity, in their final conflict, Andrews, writing at the end of the Victorian era, is discussing the trend at that time to discard the entire Old Testament, and maybe retain the literary parts of it, those that were useful for study of ancient literature, but as to it having religious authority, no, the trend of that day, in scholarly circles anyway, even on the margins of Christianity, was against the acknowledgement that the Old Testament should have any authority over Christians today. And of course, today was, well, Queen Victoria was still alive. Now, that spirit's very much in the air today. In our crowd, for instance, ex-JWs, who have bought the Marcionite argument from the 2nd century that the Old Testament is somehow a different God than the God of the New Testament. However, that's the modern version of the debate. He's dealing with the attempt to discredit the Old Testament in his own era. He says, for instance, many illustrations might be given of the growing disposition to regard the Old Testament as superannuated, having little historical value and no religious authority. Thus it was said a half-century ago by Theodore Parker, who in this matter represents a multitude, quote, "The Old Testament contains the opinions of from 40 to 50 different men, the greater part of them living from 4 to 1000 years before Jesus, and belonging to a people we should now call half-civilized. It therefore has no authority, and if an appeal is made to some command in it, we answer that nobody knows when it was given, by whom, or to whom. The physics of the Bible are shown to be a false science, its metaphysics, false philosophy, its history, often mistaken." Now, Theodore Parker is an unknown name today, but he was the Bart Ehrman of his day. At least in Christian circles, he was a voice to be reckoned with, and a voice that demanded a Christian response. Here, Andrews is part of that Christian response. He says a very recent writer, Professor Godwin Smith, in a magazine article of 1895 entitled "Christianity's Millstone," affirms the Old Testament to be this millstone. The New Testament must be separated from the Old. The two should not be bound up in the same volume. Quote, "The time has surely come when, as a supernatural revelation, the Old Testament should frankly, though reverently, be laid aside, and never more allowed to cloud the vision of free inquiry, or to cast the shadow of primal religion on our modern life." And to that, Andrews has a footnote. Some are now making an attempt to accredit the Bible by presenting it as a book for literary study. It is said that by a judicious selection of its most graphic and eloquent passages, it may be made a source of literary as well as spiritual stimulation. As expressed by one writer, quote, "Who shall say that it is not to be included in the curriculum of polite learning as a theme perhaps of equal moment with Shakespeare," unquote. This is meant to do the Bible high honor, but how could we find a more significant sign that it is ceasing to be regarded as an inspired book, unfolding to men the character and purpose of God, His mercy and grace to His Son, or in His Son, salvation from sin, the terrors of judgment, instead of being read as a book in which the voice of God is heard calling all to repentance, to obedience, and to righteousness, a voice which no man may disregard but at the peril of his soul. We are told to read it as literature, a collection of elegant extracts of biblical masterpieces. Doubtless the purpose is by appealing to the literary taste, the imagination, the sense of beautiful and sublime, to obtain for the Bible a new hold upon the attention of cultivated people. But its sacred character is thus lost. It is merely a book among books, of value for intellectual culture, but no more than the one book able to make us wise unto salvation, to which we come upon in bended knee, praying for that light from the Spirit who inspired it, without which we read in vain. Andrews continues, it is probable that some of those who are undermining the faith of men in the Old Testament are desirous of preserving a measure of faith in the New. But the two cannot be separated. We can explain the appearing of Jesus and his teachings only by accepting the covenant relation of the Jews, the law and ritual, as divinely appointed, and the divine inspiration of their prophets. Taken as a whole, there is a beautiful unity, God's purpose in the incarnation running like a golden thread through all. There is a beginning, middle, and end, but the end, separated from the beginning, is unintelligible. It is a loud modern cry that we give up the traditional Christ of the church and go back to the historical Christ. We must rediscover the long-lost Jesus. We must, by criticism of the Gospels, learn who he was and how much of what is reported in them to have said and done, he did, in fact, say and do. We can regard nothing as settled. All must be examined anew. Endless questions here arise. Who the writers of the several Gospels, the time of their composition, their relations to one another, their accuracy, the rule of interpretation, and the like. The same questions arise as to the epistles. The discussions of learned scholars have been minute and long drawn out, and we may add almost fruitless, because without any agreement of results as to the one point in question, the person of the Lord. And he also has a footnote there. It is to be noted that those who reject the personality of God make the knowledge of him to be intellectual only. As said by one, quote, theology is not a matter of faith, but of intellectual grasp and careful scholarship, unquote. And this is necessarily the case if, as we are told, we must study all forms of religion to learn, quote, the self-evolution of the idea, unquote, in them, and thus come to the knowledge of God. If God be a person, then can we all, learned and unlearned, come into personal communion with him and know him as our Father. But this approach to him is not alike open to all without regard to spiritual character. As it is in the power of a man to make himself known to some and not to others, much more is it in the power of God. Those who dare to rush unbidden into the most holy to find him will only find thick darkness. To the weary and the heavy laden, the meek and penitent, the incarnate Son says, come unto me, and they shall see his face. But to the proud and presumptuous who say, bring him to our tribunal, and we will sit in judgment on him, he is invisible. The critic who feels no need of a Redeemer may scan the pages of the evangelist with his microscope, but he will find no Son of God. Andrews goes on, it is a striking illustration of the separation between the head and the church that after 18 centuries its scholars are going back to the records of his earthly life to find out who he was. If it had continued in the heavenly fellowship to which he exalted it, it would be able to tell the world with one voice, both what he was and what he is. There is another school of critics who come to the Gospels in the Kantian spirit, who make very little of facts. The idea is all. Having the ideal Christ, we need no more. It is unimportant whether there was a real man corresponding to the ideal. It is not, it is said, by his acts as a mediator between God and us that Christ saves us, but as the representative and example of the idea of self-sacrifice. This idea, once gained through him, it must be separated from his individual person that it may become universal. He may wholly disappear from memory, but the idea remains ever active, and we need not go back to its origin. But we may not go here into details as to the several critical schools. The critics, writing from all points of view about the Lord's person and work, historic, philosophic, scientific, agnostic, evolutionary, each determining by his own pre-accepted criterion which measure of truth there may be in the gospel narrative, have filled the minds of their readers with confusion and perplexity. Almost any modern commentary is an illustration of the critical spirit of the times and of the perplexity which it brings to the common reader. A footnote. We may take, as an instance, Godet on the Gospel of John. In the first volume of 500 closely printed pages, we find 255 occupied in preliminary discussions quite beyond the reach of one not especially versed in such themes. The natural effect is to awaken doubts in our minds, for those must be very serious objections which demand such elaborate replies. Interesting that he picks a conservative example here. Godet feeling it necessary to deal with these critical issues to this, well, what did he say? First volume, 500 closely printed pages, 255 occupied with critical issues. Yes, that was the tendency of the day, and Godet and Westcott and others did an admirable job of doing it, but yes, for a lot of people this was just too much. So the simplicity of the gospel was plainly lost in this period. And then he concludes this section by saying, nor in saying this do we disparage the service which genuine criticism may give to the better understanding of biblical records. Every kind of knowledge, geological, archaeological, historical, scientific, linguistic, is valuable for the light it may cast on these records. And let there be no suppression of the light, but it is to be remembered that the real point at issue between Christianity and anti-Christianity is not the verbal accuracy or the general infallibility of the Bible. That was not a popular point of view among conservatives at that time. The Bible was not the basis. It was not the rock on which Christianity stands or falls. That was Christ himself, of course. I'll put in a link to what was going on at the very same moment that Andrews was saying all of this in the 1880s and 90s. In England, Sayce, the great archaeologist, was saying a lot about what the new science of archaeology was doing to vindicate the Bible. At the very same moment all of this was going on in other departments of science in America, especially in America at the time. What archaeology is doing to vindicate the Bible. A.H. Sayce of Oxford. See you next time.